Before I even introduce myself, for those of you who may not know me or talk about what we're going to cover today, I want to start off with a short story that I think really sets the stage for why I wanted to be here with all of you. Back in 2015, I was doing a sabbatical in Italy, taking some time away from my job to do an innovation fellowship. And as part of that fellowship, we had a team project. So a group of us were working together with an Italian company to do some type of innovation initiative. And I felt like this was like right up my alley. I did growth strategy, I loved innovation, and I'd been doing project and team management for a few years at that point. So I felt really comfortable in that space. And about a month into our team project, one of the people on my team looked at me and she delivered probably the hardest feedback I've ever received in my life. It really knocked me down. And she looked at me and she shared, Alexandra, I love spending time with you for dinner and outside of the work we do, but in the room as a team, you are one of the most difficult people to spend time with. And I was just taken aback. And I got curious and tried to ask some questions to understand. And she shared that I felt domineering, overly aggressive and assertive, and that I was trying to manage the team like I was managing work, and that it didn't feel good. And the hardest part of this feedback experience for me was that I had honestly no clue that this was the impact I was having and this was the way she was experiencing me. And really, it led to three incredibly important insights and tough lessons to swallow at the time. And that is one, feedback is far too rare. My team member was able to deliver this feedback because the stakes were pretty low. We were peers. We didn't work in an organization together. So delivering this feedback for her was pretty low risk. She wasn't putting an important relationship at work on the line, and she wasn't at risk of losing a job. And the fact is most of the time, that's not the case. The people that we need feedback from the most at work and at home, in those relationships, the stakes are very high. And it leads to people holding feedback back. And it's a big problem. How big? We'll come back to that later in the presentation because I have a pretty shocking statistic to share with you on that. The second insight was too often the feedback we receive sucks. I'm 100% certain that her experience was not unique. And as I started to replay past events in my life through the lens of this feedback and started to replay past feedback I'd received, I realized people were trying to suggest some of these themes to me, but they were doing it in such an ambiguous way that I wasn't really able to understand the feedback I was receiving. And so I tended to just kind of let it go in one ear and out the other. And the final big insight that I think sets the stage for our conversation today is that external awareness, that is the awareness of how other people perceive us, isn't enough. I understood what I was doing once I received that feedback, but I didn't know what to do with that insight because most of what I was doing, as is the case with all of us, was subconscious. And for that reason, it was really hard for me to understand what was the programming inside that was leading me to interpret these really otherwise nice situations as being conflict. And that led me to realize, you've really got to cultivate a lot of internal awareness as well. And we're going to jump into how to do that and what exactly that means in this presentation. So with that, that led me down really what's now been an 8-year journey. I'm sure it will continue to really cultivate greater self-awareness in an effort to grow and lead with greater confidence, ease, and joy. And what I'd like to do over the next 30 minutes-ish is to really share my most valuable insights from both my personal journey and my client work, And my intention is to do three things for you. One, I want to provide you with a really clear definition and framework for self-awareness, because self-awareness can mean a lot of different things, and it's not specific enough for us to take action on it. I can't just become more self-aware. So we need to get clear on exactly what it means so that we can start to carve a path forward. The second is we're going to do some activities to help you raise awareness of your potential self-awareness gaps and how they might be holding you back. And then finally, I want to give you some options for how you might approach improving self-awareness. So with that context and those three objectives, I want to make two invitations to you. The first is to be fully present. We're going to move through a fair amount of information pretty quickly. And there are a couple activities that are designed to really help you put these concepts into practice. The second is I want to invite you to share your reflections and questions in the comments. And the final thing is I'll just share a little bit about me so you can understand why should I be listening to this person if you don't know me, or maybe we worked together years ago when I had far less self-awareness. So my name is Alexandra. I call myself a growth guide. I work with leaders and teams to help them figure out where are we going to go? What's our vision for success? How do we get there? And how do we do the internal work necessary to drive that transformation and achieve that vision with greater confidence, ease, and joy? So a lot of the work I do really starts with cultivating self-awareness, because without that, we can't do all the work outside. So with that, let's dive in. And we're going to start by answering the question, what exactly is self-awareness? So self-awareness at its most basic level is your understanding of who you are, how you experience life, and how others experience you. And now there are kind of two dimensions to self-awareness that I want to call out while we're on this page. The first dimension is context. There's self-awareness around who we are intrinsically. So that first point, those are those immutable qualities of ourself, like our purpose and our unique gifts. And then the second context is situational, right? That is our experiences of specific contexts, like work or home, or specific moments in time in life. And then the second dimension is perspective. And you can have the perspective of self. So that is, how am I perceiving my intrinsic and situational self-awareness? And the second perspective is others. What's my self-awareness of how others perceive me in both those contexts, right? Intrinsic versus situational. So if we kind of bring these together and lay those out, what we end up with is really an understanding of 4 distinct types of self-awareness. And if you take anything from this presentation, I think this is one of the most important things. And so for the 4 types of self-awareness, you'll see, let's start with intrinsic, right? So that's that first column. And that is, who are we at our core? There's the self view, that top quadrant in the first column. And that's really an understanding of our purpose, our values, and our beliefs. And then as you shift down, there's how do other people view that? And what's our understanding, right? How aware are we of others' perceptions of who we are? And that includes how they perceive your purpose, your unique gifts, and your relative strengths and weaknesses. That last of which is particularly important in a workplace context, and we'll come back to that later. As we shift into the second column, you'll see now we're talking about situational self-awareness. So that's self-awareness of how we experience life and the impact we have on others. So the self view considers what are the mindsets with which we approach situations that determine how we approach them, how we show up in them, and how we choose our response. And then there's also the reaction patterns, right? So once we're in a situation, what are the patterns that have carved a groove into our subconscious around the meaning we make and the responses we choose and the stories we tell ourselves about that experience after the fact? 95% of your cognition is subconscious. So I really want to reinforce the importance of understanding this top quadrant here of how you experience life, because those subconscious patterns, the mindsets, those reaction grooves that you've carved will determine 95% of your success. And if you don't have awareness of them, you can't change them. And then finally, there's, the view of others, right? And how they perceive our impact in a situation. So that would include things like, how did your actions land? What was the impact of an experience they had on your relationship? And again, it's about raising your awareness of others' perceptions. We talk about this in the context of our self-awareness. So before we dive into why these are important, I've already touched on a few points, but we're going to talk about some other ones in a moment. And even more importantly, what can you do to actually raise your self-awareness in each quadrant? I want to do a short activity to help you explore how self-aware are you and where might you have some blind spots. So I shared this is going to be a little interactive. So I'd like to invite you to get out a pen and paper and make a short list of the letters A through H, just in a column. So I'll give you just a moment to do that. All right. So hopefully you have the letters written down. If not, that's okay too. We're going to keep going and you can catch up. So what I'd like you to do is to read each of these statements and reflect on how much you agree or disagree on a scale of 1 to 5 with each of the statements. And then write down next to the letter, what is your response? So I'll give you, when I timed this with my sister, who was generous enough to practice this, it took about a minute and a half. So I'm going to give you just a minute to a minute and a half to gauge your self-awareness for each statement or your level of agreement. All right, we'll take about 30 more seconds. Again, just quickly go through this, trust your gut. You again should end up with A through H and then a number 1 through 5 next to each letter. Okay, so now what I'm going to have you do is to tally the numbers, and you're specifically going to tally A plus B, C plus D, E plus F, and G plus H. And I'm going to put these in the chat for you because now that we're away from the slide, I think it might be helpful to have them as reference. Because now we're going to talk about what they mean and how you can use your responses to gauge where do I have relatively high self-awareness and where do I have relatively low self-awareness. So the places where you have relatively high scores, meaning you strongly agreed with the statements, are places where you have relatively high self-awareness. The places where you have relatively low scores would be places where you have relatively low self-awareness. So in that top quadrant, here we're talking about our intrinsic and self. So we're talking about our own internal view of who we are as a person. The statements that correspond to that are, I have a deep sense of purpose and I make difficult life decisions with ease. That's because when we know what our purpose is, that tends to give us a deep sense of fulfillment and purpose, right? So A is obvious. The difficult decisions with ease, that's up there because when we have a really strong sense of our values, what are the things that matter to us, that enables us to make challenging decisions about life. For example, should we take this job or that job? Should we pursue this opportunity or that, with far greater ease? Because we have an internal compass to help us guide decisions where there may not be one right or obvious external answer. As we shift down, so we're talking about, again, intrinsic awareness. Now we're talking about our awareness of how others perceive who we are. The statements that correspond to that are, I feel seen, understood, and valued. And I know my strengths and weaknesses. And those correspond to this quadrant, because when we know how others view us and who we are, and that can lead to us feeling a great sense of being seen, understood, and valued by the people we love, because we're getting that feedback and that positive reinforcement that who we are is being received and valued by the people around us. And also in this box is a real true understanding of your strengths and weaknesses. And I put that here because a really interesting fact is Korn Ferry did some research where they looked at self-awareness among leaders, and they found that 80% of leaders had one or more skills or competencies that they self-identified as a strength, but that other people in their life identified as a weakness. That's a pretty shocking blind spot, right? You think, I'm a phenomenal communicator. And then you get feedback from everyone else that says, communication is actually your weakness. So what that suggests is that really knowing our strengths and weaknesses hinges on having really good feedback from others to inform our self-awareness. Now we're going to shift over into the situational. So under here are E and F. So I easily express my feelings and I navigate challenging situations with ease. So the reason those are here is because when you have a really strong understanding of what are the mindsets that I'm using and tapping into in any given moment, you're really able to choose how you want to approach situations and create a greater sense of calm and control in the moment and how you respond. And then if you have a good awareness of what's happening inside as you experience situations, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? How is that impacting my action? That means you're going to have a much easier time expressing your feelings to others, right? So that's why those correspond. And finally, in that G through H box, we have, I receive unprompted feedback often, and I'm rarely surprised by feedback. And those live here because if you have good awareness of what other people, how they're perceiving you and how you impact them, then you likely are getting feedback consistently, right? You live in a culture where people are exchanging feedback, and that feedback won't surprise you because you're doing a good job tracking over time, how is the way I'm showing up impacting others? So with that, I want to share just first, let's acknowledge this is a really short activity. It's not meant to be a predictor of your self-awareness. It's meant for you to identify, where do I have some opportunities? And where you have opportunities, how can I dig in? And it can be a little bit demoralizing, of course, to work through that. And I think often we can think, my gaps or my weaknesses they are what they are. Why do anything about them? So what I'd like to talk about is why you should care about improving self-awareness. Like, why does it really matter to do the work? And so what many leaders I work with don't realize when we start working together is that low self-awareness is a root cause of the day-to-day frustrations and pain they experience. So what I'd like to do is walk through how might low self-awareness in each of those four quadrants be impacting your life and your life experience in some pretty negative ways. Um, and hopefully that might give you a sense of, okay, maybe there is a there for me to do some work if you have relatively low self-awareness in that space. So we're going to start with the price of low self-awareness when we talk about intrinsic, that first column. So same order we've been going through. So when we talk about our self-understanding of who we are, when we have low self-awareness of our purpose, our values, and our beliefs, that can lead to a sense of ennui about life. Is this it? Right? How many of you have experienced that? Is this it? Is this all there is? And that can happen because we don't have a sense of purpose that gives meaning to our day-to-day life. When we don't have values, we may struggle to make life decisions, right? Because we don't have an internal compass to help us choose between choices that on their surface or externally seem relatively equal. And it can lead also to motivation feeling forced, because when we don't have that sense of purpose and meaning, and we're not able to choose situations that really feel for us, it can feel like we have to push ourselves each day to get in, get up, and put in the work. And when you have to force that motivation and put in the work for things that don't feel that meaningful, that's actually a really big contributing factor to burnout. And I want to point out there's some really compelling research that shows two people can be working the same number of hours. And those hours for a period of time may be a little excessive or over the average. But one of them may not experience burnout while the other does. And the reason? It's because the one who doesn't experience burnout is able to find meaning in the work they're doing and able to find purpose in the effort, which allows them to persist through a challenge. I want to acknowledge that's not the only thing that contributes to burnout, but it is one really important factor to consider. And if you're experiencing it, I'd invite you to reflect on how aware am I of, my deep sense of self, and am I making choices that align to that? So we'll shift into the price of low self-awareness. So others' views of your who, right? So that bottom quadrant in that first column. When you aren't aware and you're not receiving the feedback and validation from others in your life that they see and understand you and value you for who you are, that's going to lead to feelings of disconnection and loneliness. It will also lead to competency blind spots, right? We've already talked about that point from Korn Ferry that shows we don't have awareness of how other people view us and our unique strengths and weaknesses, we tend to get them wrong. And finally, both of those things, a feeling of disconnection and withdrawing and a lack of self-awareness around our unique strengths and our weaknesses can lead us to missing opportunities or getting passed over for promotions or missing work. Maybe if you have your own business, a client chooses somebody else because the way that you're presenting yourself isn't resonating with the perception others have of you. And so that disconnect will lead to people not quite embracing and wanting to work with you as much as might be your potential. So now we're going to shift into the price of low self-awareness in a situational context. So we'll start with the self. So my understanding of my experience of life. So what are the mindsets that lead to how I approach situations? And what are the reaction patterns or grooves that are carved into my subconscious that dictate how I respond and the story I tell myself later? When you have low awareness of those things inside you, you will likely experience more anxiety because you worry about future situations, because they feel outside of your control and you're not confident in your ability to navigate them. It can also lead to rumination and regret, because when you don't have the self-awareness of how you're showing up and why, it can lead you to respond in situations in ways that you later wish, gosh, I wish I'd done something differently, or I wish I'd said that differently. And so you might experience a lot of rumination or replaying the past and regret about how you showed up. It can also lead to emotional volatility, because when we don't feel like we have a firm rooted sense of self and how we're experiencing and responding to situations, we can tend to feel like we're a victim of circumstance and on an emotional roller coaster. And it can finally lead us to really struggle with change, specifically behavioral change in ourselves. So like that story I told from 8 years ago in 2015, when I got that feedback about how poorly I was showing up as a team member and a leader, it was one thing to know that my impact wasn't matching my intent. It was a very different thing to understand what were the subconscious patterns that were leading me to show up in that way and how could I change them. And it took me a long time to shift how I was showing up at work, because I really needed to unpack those internal subconscious, filters and grooves that led me to have behavior that I didn't like. And having a greater awareness of those things is what allows you to make change that sticks with greater ease. Finally, the price of low awareness, when we're talking about others' perceptions of how you're showing up in specific contexts or situations. When you have low awareness of that, that can lead to fractured relationships, because you may be consistently doing things that are negatively impacting people's experience of you without having the self-awareness to make repair and make change. And as your relationships fracture and break down, you will likely, especially in a work context, miss opportunities. Like low intrinsic awareness of how other people perceive you, you will miss opportunities because your intent isn't matching your impact. And it may also, in a more personal context, lead to loneliness, because as those relationships fall apart and we feel like we can't do anything about them, we're likely to start to feel isolation, distancing, and a sense of disconnection. So these are pretty extreme outcomes, but if any of these resonate with you, I'd invite you to consider, how might raising my awareness in this area of myself, my life, and how others perceive and experience me be contributing to those challenges or pains that I'm experiencing? And, it can, I want to acknowledge, like I said before, it can feel pretty demoralizing to be starting from a place of like, gosh, I'm in my, 30s, 40s, 50s, and I still don't really have a grasp on this stuff. That's true for most people. So let's normalize it and say, just acknowledge we are where we are, and that's okay. The choice is, what do we want to do, if anything, to improve the future? And so with that, I'd like to invite you to consider, as we move through this final section, which is, how can I improve my self-awareness? Consider, what are maybe 1 to 2 specific things I can do today or tomorrow to start myself down that journey. So I'm going to share a fair amount of options with you. I invite you just to listen and absorb, and then reach out later. I'm happy to share some free detailed resources to help you really dive in and then create your plan. So when we talk about raising self-awareness, the first thing to talk about is, what's the general cycle of how that happens? So it's a virtuous cycle, right? The more we do, the more we have, and the easier it gets. Because as our life circumstances change, as the people that come in and out of our life change, we'll need to continue to cultivate self-awareness. It's not like a one and done. We don't get there, arrive, and we're finished. So it starts, one of the first and most important things you can do is to increase what I like to call your perceptive capacity. That is your ability to be in the moment, present, gathering information from your external surroundings and your internal experience of the moment so that you can better understand what's my experience inside, what's the information I'm getting about how others are experiencing me outside, and to start to make more meaning from that, right? So the more perceptive capacity we have, the greater ability we have to open the blinders, take in more information, and raise that awareness. Second thing you can do to set the stage is to really cultivate growth mindsets. That is to really cultivate a deep belief in yourself that change is possible. Where I am today does not dictate where I am in the future. The third thing you can do is to gather information, right? As I mentioned before, self-awareness is a constant evolution and practice. So really creating practices for yourself that allow you to passively gather information in the moment and then actively gather information after the fact will help you to have the insight you need so that you can reflect and learn. So we're going to talk about two of these circles. I want to share some real tangible practices for you. The first is we're going to talk about some things you can do to increase your perceptive capacity. And the second we'll talk about is what are some specific tactics you can do to gather information and reflect and learn and turn it into insight. So on the perceptive capacity, right? You can think about your cognitive and emotional capacity to collect information that informs your self-awareness as a battery. And anything we do that we can do things that charge our battery and we can do things that deplete our battery. And chargers, right, would be things that ensure we're healthy, reduce stress, and enable us to be more present in the moment. Depleters would be things that first and foremost contribute to stress. Because what happens when we experience stress is our nervous system triggers a cascade of biological responses, one of which is a physical narrowing of your vision and tunnel vision, which corresponds to a narrowing in your mind of your field of focus and where you're gathering information from. So when you're stressed, your mind is going to necessarily block out information about what I'm feeling in the moment. It's going to block out information like maybe bodily reactions or nonverbal communications in a meeting because it's tunnel visioning on the source of stress. So stress can have a really negative impact on self-awareness if unmitigated. So if you're experiencing a lot of stress, the number one thing you can do to improve your self-awareness is to intentionally create practices in your life that allow you to reduce the number of stressors and better re-regulate your body when you experience stress so that you're able to get out of that stress reaction. If you want kind of a short guide for tactics that you can do, please send me an email. I'll share that with you. It's been really helpful for a lot of my clients, and I already have it put together. Now we're going to talk about specific tactics. I'm going to share this graphic. We're not going to talk about all of these in detail. That would take too long. But what I wanted to give you was a sense of what are some activities that I could do in each of these areas that would help me to improve my self-awareness and to target the choices of activities based on where you might have unique self-awareness gaps. And similar to the stress reduction, I have a complimentary guide that includes a detailed description of all of these and links to resources. So if you'd like to dive in, please reach out, send me an email. I'm happy to share that with you. A couple of things I'll point out on here that I think are really important to take away from this is one, a great place to start if you know you have a lot of room to improve in your self-awareness is with a 360 assessment. And most people associate 360 assessments with gaining insight into that bottom row. So how do others perceive us? And maybe some 360s really focus on how do others perceive us, maybe in a situational context. I really like the IPEC 360. It's the one I use with my clients because it also includes in that top quadrant, a leadership mindset assessment, which gives insight into what are the mindsets with which I'm approaching life. What are the beliefs that are underpinning those mindsets? So insight into that top column around who am I intrinsically. And it allows you to capture information from others about how they perceive your unique strengths and weaknesses. So that bottom quadrant, intrinsic awareness of others' perceptions. And of course, it gives you insight into others' perceptions of your performance and your skills. So if you haven't done a 360 in a long time, or you want to really, I like to say, wipe the slate clean. So play catch up and set the stage for, how am I going to continue this practice? A 360 is a great place to start. If you want to make the most impact and progress over a short period of time, I would encourage you to consider coaching, because no matter how much work we do to cultivate our self-awareness on our own, we can't always see the boxes that we put ourselves in, right? And those boxes are, the walls of them are limiting beliefs, gremlin messages, maybe blinders that we've put on that prevent us from seeing our peripheral vision and picking up those cues. So we need often an external view, and a coach can help give that to you by mirroring back and offering observations. They can also support you in cultivating your own skills to receive and get feedback. Most leaders I work with ask for feedback a lot, and they rarely get meaningful feedback. And that's because getting feedback is a lot harder than just asking people, is there anything I could be doing differently to support you? And a coach can really help you to get clear on how to get good, actionable, helpful feedback and how to work through those practices. And then a couple other things I want to point out about this list is a lot of these are activities that are completely free. So, or almost no cost. So the Earn Life and the Eulogy in that top corner are both self-guided reflection exercises that help you to get more clarity on who you are, what your values are, and what are the beliefs that you hold. So again, I've provided more resources and details and links so that if you want to do those, reach out. I'll share that. The Pew 12 is my favorite journaling exercise that helps you to raise awareness of your experience in a situation so that you can create more conscious choice about your response. Totally free, and something I would encourage you to do regularly. StrengthsFinder, I think you're all familiar with that. You can take that assessment for, I think, $49, right? And then again, feedback conversations and milestone retrospectives, those don't cost you anything but time. And getting good feedback, I know, is harder than just asking for it and expecting you'll get it. And I've put together a few great resources on how to get more feedback and get better feedback. So again, reach out if that's something you're interested in. I'll share some links to some of my favorite blog posts and resources. With that, I want to thank you all for joining me today and invite you to get in touch. So please send me an email if you would like a copy of this deck, complimentary self-awareness resources, or if you have specific questions for which you'd like answers. I'm always happy to just hop on a call and share. And my email's here. You can also find it if you go to my LinkedIn page and click contact info. And please schedule a time to talk if you're interested in hosting a conversation like this with your team. I would be happy to do this presentation and host an interactive conversation about it at your workplace. So if that interests you, please reach out. I think it'd be a lot of fun, and it would give you an opportunity to talk about how you can support each other to raise each other's awareness, right? Because this type of work is done best when in a community environment. I also am certified to offer the IPEC 360 and the leadership mindset assessment. So if those are things you're interested in, schedule time to talk or send me an email. I'll share what that experience looks like, what you can expect to get out of it, and the investment options. And there are some pretty low cost investment options there. And the final thing I would invite you to reach out about is coaching. And I'll just share here, I have a really great group coaching program for high performing leaders that's starting in September. And one of the first things we'll do is to really raise our self-awareness so that we can set really targeted, powerful development goals that focus your growth on the right things, those that are most impactful and going to yield the best results. And you'll get to do it in a community of other growth-minded peers. With that, I want to thank you for joining me. I do see a question in here around anonymous feedback is helpful. I always think anonymous feedback is helpful. The thing I always like to share with people about feedback is feedback says as much about you as it does about the person who gave it. You always want to take feedback and filter it through that lens, right? And when it's anonymous, what I suggest is looking for trends. So when you're getting anonymous feedback, you really want to take one piece of feedback with a bit of a grain of salt. But if you start to see a trend in anonymous feedback, that's when you really want to pay attention and say, okay, there's something here that I need to work on. All right, with that, I'll say thank you so much for joining. Please reach out. And if this was helpful for you, please do share with a friend, a colleague, or someone else who might benefit from learning about how they can raise their own self-awareness, and in doing so, dramatically improve their life, leadership, and impact. Thank you, and have a lovely day.